Advanced Heroquest, The Secret Passage, Part 2. The assembled guards stopped their drinking and shouting, dropped their tankards, unsheathed their weapons, and turned their full attention to the blood-splattered dwarf who now darkened their doorway. In return, Sven carefully eyed up each of his foes, unconsciously thumbing the grip of his hammer as he did so. A mere few weeks earlier, these men would have been his allies. But now they were no better than the ratsmen and the hobgoblins that he had already killed. Such a waste. This reflection caused Sven to give a moment's thought to his erstwhile ally, Lambert Lemberger, whose bloody body now lay at the dwarf's feet. The murderer's tale of terror was ended, but it had been the barbarian's last act of spite that had led to this unnecessary conflict. Anger once more sparked into life in Sven's gut. Such a waste. However, the dwarf suddenly noticed a silver lining to this dark cloud. One more ingredient to this foul concoction that he had not expected to ever see again.
What? That meddlesome Goldsmanga is here?
Screeched Broglus, half-eaten food flying from the sorcerer of Nurgle's mouth as he spoke.
Ha! I told you you'd not escape me, Hexcaster,
replied Sven.
I knew I could not trust Kronthrak to hold him. Guards! This is the one I told you about. Kill him now!
Sven smiled and raised up his father's hammer. In this part of the expedition, the party solely consisted of the wounded dwarf mercenary Sven Hammerhelm, the infamous dwarf who darkens the door. Sven wielded his father's hammer and possessed a dawnstone containing 7 fate points. From his fight with his rival, Lambert Lemberger, the dwarf had suffered 2 points worth of damage before this combat began, that still remained unhealed. Lemberger lay dead at Sven's feet, but the killing was far from done. Ahead of the dwarf lay a quest room, the guard room for those that had regularly patrolled the jail of the dungeon. That was until Kronthog Hornhelm had taken over and given those duties to his own lackeys. Now, the human guards had little to do apart from patrolling the ground floor above and carousing with the sorcerer of Nurgle, Broglus, who enjoyed nothing more than having a near-captive audience. With the room revealed, we flipped over one of our monster generation cards to see how many points were in the room. We got 14 points worth of monsters, in addition to the sorcerer. With the points generated, our GM chose to deploy a sergeant and 4 men-at-arms, each identically armed with a sword and shield. Next came the surprise roll. This the GM won with a 5, meaning he would get to set up his troops as he liked, and then Sven's player was allowed to move them up to 1 square each. The GM set up Broglus at the rear of the room, hoping his magics could be deployed in support of the guards, whom he set up near the ingress, with 2 placed directly in front of the door. Sven's player then moved each of the guards back a square to prevent the dwarf from being swamped on the first turn. And so it began. Since the GM had won the roll off, the guards got to act first, and it was the sergeant who kicked things off, moving up to meet the dwarf in the doorway, shield up and sword poised to run the stunty through. Sven, too, raised up his weapon, but The slightly elevated position of the sergeant gave the corrupted human the edge over the dwarf. This he took full advantage of, and his blow struck, evading Sven's attempts at parrying the attack, although the sergeant had sacrificed some of its killing power in order to achieve this, and as Sven was armoured to the gills, the human sword failed to cause a single wound. Nevertheless, inspired by his leader's example, the next nearest guardsman rushed past the sergeant out into the corridor to attack Sven. However, the dwarf was ready. The guard required a 9 to hit, but only got a 6. Sven ducking, leaving the guard's blow to harmlessly slice the air above the dwarf's head. The remaining 3 guardsmen flashed each other a look. Perhaps there was more to this escapee than met the eye. In response, each moved up in support of their fellows, but could not as yet reach the interloper. From behind, the sorcerer Broglus too moved up, edging as close to the fray as he could get, biding his time until he could use his magics to see off his nemesis. With his shield held up against the towering sergeant, Sven turned his attention to the guard in the corridor alongside him. With the human's weapon skill of 7, Sven required a 5 to hit, and he easily got it, rolling an 8. The guard's shield and leather armor afforded him a decent amount of protection, represented by his toughness of 8. Sven's player still fancied his chances, though. He rolled for damage and duly inflicted 3 bludgeoning wounds on the human, smashing the Umgi across the head with such force that it broke his neck. The man dropped like a discarded marionette, the light in his eyes sharply blinking out of existence. Sven placed a boot on the corpse and moved out of the immediate reach of the corrupted sergeant-at-arms, whilst also hoping to draw more of his foes into the confined corridor. With the dwarf now directly in front of him, the nearest man-at-arms thrust at Sven with his pig sticker. He required a 9, but only got a 3. Sven smirked as he avoided the clumsy attack. Embarrassed, but thankful to have not fumbled, the young guardsman slunk back to make way for his more experienced brethren. Immediately, one strode forth to take his place. This guardsman too required a 9 to hit, but likewise failed to do so, only getting a 5. With a frown of annoyance at his useless underlings, the sergeant moved out into the corridor and lunged at the increasingly vexing dwarf. The sergeant needed an 8 to hit, but instead took a leaf out of his comrade's books and got a 3, missing. To finish the phase, both the remaining guardsmen and Broglus moved up to shore up the struggling ranks. Sven glowered at the sergeant and raised up his hammer, eager to strike down his foe. Sven needed a 6. He rolled, and he hit with an 8, the dwarf's hammer smashing into the helm of the human. Sven rolled his 6 damage dice, and 2 of them beat the sergeant's toughness of 10, with 1. Yes, with 1 being a critical that allowed Sven's player to roll an additional die. This too, causing a wound, bringing the total up to 3. Just enough to kill the man. Sven's hammer cracking open the human skull and bloodily embedding itself in his brain pan. Sven grinned, barged the falling body out of the way, and moved up to return to his previous position. If he could keep this up, he could potentially whittle down the whole room before even stepping across its threshold. Yet another man-at-arms found himself faced with the dwarf who darkens the door. He drew his sword back, leaned in with his shield, and thrust at his enemy, requiring a 9 to hit and rolling a whopping 11. Sven drew in his shield at the very last moment and braced for impact. Next, the guard would need to roll another 11 with their 4 damage dice to repeat the feat and draw blood. He rolled, getting a 5, an 8, another 8, and a 10. His blade crashing against the dwarf's mail, bruising Sven, but neither wounding nor inflicting any real damage. As this was the first part of the human's move attack action, he was now free to move out of the way and let his allies enter the fray. Immediately, the guardsman diagonally adjacent to Sven stepped out into the corridor to flank the dwarf and hacked at him with his sword. Sven was ready though, and turned away the clumsy thrust with his father's hammer, causing the attacker to fumble his weapon, dropping it onto the stone floor. Sven grinned as he counterattacked. He needed a 5, and he got it. He rolled his 6 damage dice, requiring an 8 to wound. He rolled and caused 5 damage, his hammer snapping the neck of the would-be killer in a flash of bold defiance. And yet, still they came. The last of the guardsmen rushed the blood-stained dwarf, his angry roar echoing around the room. "Die, Stante!" But it was all bravado, and he failed to get past Sven's defences. Brogulus was not eager to face off against the dwarf alone again, and so he cast the Cloak of Dain by throwing a pinch of green dragon dust into the air, causing an ethereal cloak of pale green light to coalesce and draw itself over the adjacent guardsman, raising his toughness by 1 until the end of the combat turn. The sorcerer hoping that this would slow the dwarf down. It did not. Sven couldn't help but curl back his lips as he tasted the stench of magic in the air, and he redoubled his grip on his father's hammer, eager to stamp its nauseating influence out. The dwarf required a 5 to hit the enchanted guard, but aced it, scoring a critical, allowing him to attack again, although, unfortunately, this second attack was mired by Sven's over-enthusiasm and failed to land. However, the first still did, and Sven rolled his 6 damage dice, requiring an 8 to wound on each. 3 struck true, including a critical that gave him an additional roll, which also wounded. 4 damage was more than enough to kill his foe, and as the body hit the floor, Sven finally stepped over the threshold to the guard room, his eyes never leaving those of the sorcerer of Nurgle.
"Guard, come out from behind that table and kill this interfering goldmonger."
And so ordered the last guardsman, fearing Brogulus more than he feared Sven, charged the dwarf. He needed a 9 to hit. He got a 5. Outclassed, his sword visibly began to tremble in his grip. Sven's eyes narrowed, and he glowered at the human. There was now no other recourse. Brogulus moved up to face off against Sven once again. The sorcerer too required a 9 to strike at the still wounded dwarf. He raised his steel staff up and brought it crashing down, but the attack was amateurish, and Sven had no trouble in moving out of the way. It was now Sven's turn to attack. Sven began by turning his attention to the man-at-arms. He wanted to savour Brogulus' death without the buzzing of some guardsmen in the periphery. He needed a 5 to hit and rolled an 11, allowing him to roll his 6 damage dice. It was a mighty blow, and 4 of the 6 dice easily overcame the guard's toughness, enough to smash through the human's helmet and crack his skull open. The guard dropped dead without a scream. Sven, though, gave him no more thought, instead bringing his full fury to bear upon Brogulus, hot urine suddenly soaking the sorcerer's robes.
"Get away from me, you filthy goldmonger!"
Brogulus spat as he turned tail and fled into the depths of the guard room, hoping to put enough distance between them to be able to employ his foul magics. It was a sound strategy, for Sven's legs were indeed little. However, unlike the last time the two had fought, the sorcerer had no magical circle to heal his wounds, and Sven was armed with his father's hammer. Sven's hammer could be used as a throwing weapon, with a range of 5 and the move and throw rule to boot, and the dwarf intended to take full advantage of this. Sven strode forwards, using his full speed allowance of 6 squares to bring him directly in line with the sorcerer, a mere 2 squares between them. Sven had a bow skill of 6, but his hammer gave him a +2 bonus to hit when throwing the weapon. And so, with all his might, he threw his hammer at Broglus. He needed a 6, reduced to a 4 by a special weapon, but he didn't need the help. Anger guided his weapon, and revenge greased its path. His hammer flew true and smashed into the poisonous mage, scoring an 8 and allowing Sven's player to roll 6 damage dice. Broglus had a toughness of 7 and 4 wounds. Sven rolled a 2, a 7, a 5, 2 8s, and a 12, which allowed him to roll another die. Another 12, and then again an 11, inflicting a whopping 6 wounds on the sorcerer. Broglus didn't even have time for any last words, as Sven's hammer crashed into his skull, cracking it apart like an eggshell hit by a mallet. It was done. The game now returned to an exploration turn, and Sven's attention was drawn to the large treasure chest at the end of the room. Sven moved up, opened it up, and rolled on the treasure chest table in the main rulebook, getting a 12, which meant it was a magic treasure. Next, Sven's player had to roll 2 dice on the magical treasure table. This time he got a 12 and a 7, for a total of 19, which meant he had discovered a magical bow. Sven's player then rolled on the magical bow table, and found that he had uncovered an ensorcelled crossbow with a range of 48 that inflicted 5 dice of damage. A fine weapon for an upstanding dwarf like Sven Hammerhelm. And so, with that, Sven shut the chest, sat down upon it, and cracked open a couple of bottles of booze from the nearby tables to recover his lost wounds. The grog was bad, but tasted good after all that killing. Next, he'd need to go searching for the secret passage out of this fetid jail. As Sven drank, he patted down each of the dead guardsmen and found a total of 140 gold coins upon their corpses. He decided against checking the foul-smelling body of Broglus, though. That cheapskate had nothing that he wanted. This brought Sven's total gold to 920 gold coins. In our games, we play the house rule that each character cannot carry any more gold than double their strength, multiplied by 100. So, Sven was getting close to his limit of 1,200. But not there yet.